The question that this presentation is looking to answer is, are politicians skirting fundraising law through independent expenditures? This data story represents an exploration of data from a single election year, leading into the resulting implications for the last 14 years of independent expenditures and what they may mean for the future of contributions to political candidates. This data story is intended for use by political researchers, students of political campaign finance, political campaigns, political rights and activist groups, as well as corporate political arms and political action committees. Since the 2010 Citizen United v. FEC ruling that secured the right of corporations to pursue independent expenditures as a means of affecting political campaigns and candidates, the use of 24K independent transactions have been the primary vehicle for candidate contributions by corporate political arms, PACs, and super PACs. Independent expenditures are not contributions and are not subject to limits. As defined by the FEC, an independent expenditure is an expenditure for a communication, such as a website, newspaper, TV, or direct mail advertisement that expressly advocates the election or defeat of a clearly identified candidate and is not made in consultation or cooperation with or at the request or suggestion of any candidate or his or her authorized committees or agents, or political party committee or its agents. Some important independent transaction types are 24K, contribution made to non-affiliated committee, 18K, contribution received from registered filer, 24A, independent expenditure opposing election of a candidate, and 24E, independent expenditure advocating election of a candidate. This data story has evolved around the notion that 24K transactions are being improperly utilized as a means of political fundraising that have no contribution limits, despite, paradoxically, being expressly defined as a contribution. This disparity between 24K transaction and the requisite 18K receipts corresponding to a 24K transaction is significant and enduring. Not 1 year since 2008 has seen equivalent 18K receipts corresponding with that year's 24K contributions. This visualization looks to answer the question, how does the frequency of 24K contributions in 2020 compare to previous years? 2020 saw a disproportionate increase in the use of 24K transactions relative to previous years. This significant increase in the use of 24K transactions in 2020 was the catalyst and starting point for this data story. It represents a strong variation from previous years and may represent a change in tactic for political fundraising. This visualization looks to answer the question, how does the spending of 24K contributions in 2020 compare to previous years? Despite the greater frequency of 24K transactions, these transactions are heavily outspent by 24A and 24E transactions. 24K transactions are traditionally the third most utilized per dollar of independent transactions. This means that the sharp increase in use of 24K transactions in 2020 represents many small contributions. This visualization looks to answer the question, how many 24K transactions are contributed per year to each party? The highly disproportionate number of 24K transactions received by both the Republican Party and the party listed as unknown in 2020 is atypical of previous years. At first glance, this sharp increase in transaction count received by the Republican Party could represent a large increase in sum funding to the Republicans. Yet the data that follows shows this not to be true. The amount received by the party listed as unknown is unprecedented and will be explained further in following slides. This visualization looks to answer the question, what dollar amount does each party receive in 24K contributions per year? Despite the highly skewed number of contributions toward Republicans, Democrats and Republicans received nearly equivalent amounts of 24K funding in 2020. However, the most interesting point comes in the distribution of funds for the unknown party. This will be discussed in the following slide. This data from this slide shows that the 24K contributions directed towards the Republicans were small in sum but high in quantity, while the Democrats received large sums in small quantities. This data is important in understanding the type of contributor each party is receiving the contributions from. Republicans received a strong majority of these small donations from a right-leaning fundraising platform who raised the donations from individuals. Democrats, on the other hand, are receiving large sums from corporate political arms and PACs. The contributions received by the party listed as unknown were raised by the same right-leaning fundraising platform, which received large quantity of small sums. This visualization looks to answer the question, what is the distribution of 24K transactions for the unknown party in 2020? Of the 279,918 24K transactions contributed to the party listed as unknown in 2020, Donald Trump received 279,203 of them. Of the $44,833,320 in 24K contributions received by the party listed as unknown in 2020, Donald Trump received $44,192. This visualization serves to demonstrate the ability of a single candidate to receive more than 40 million in contributions outside of traditional fundraising limits. This final visualization looks to answer the question, is yearly spending on 24K transactions fully accounted for by 18K receipts? Over the past 14 years, only 30% of the total sum of 24K contributions are accounted for in 18K receipts, 0 of which were filed by Donald Trump. This graph represents the crux of the argument that fundraising protocol, primarily the filing of requisite 18K receipts, is being skirted. The fact that both parties are receiving nearly equivalent 24K contributions each year means it's likely that both parties are failing to file the requisite 18K receipts. One point is clear, that Donald Trump filed $0 in 18K receipts. In conclusion, it is clear from the data that the use of 24K transactions as an avenue of political fundraising by political candidates and committees is worth hundreds of millions of dollars a year. These contributions are poorly regulated and are outside of the purview of traditional contribution limits. 2020 saw the rise of a high number, small in sum 24K contributions. This represents a deviation from the traditional use of 24K transactions. This deviation may represent a new means of direct contribution from individuals to political candidates. Though these transactions are tracked upon contribution, the receipt of these 24K transactions fails to be regulated. A single candidate was able to receive more than 40 million in contributions without filing a single 18K receipt. At best, this failure to file the requisite 18K receipt is a failure of protocol. At worst, it is a misappropriation of funds amounting to failed regulation and the potential skirting of traditional campaign finance law. These findings are not limited to a single party. The issue is pervasive throughout the entire political field. The next step of investigation as a result of the findings within this presentation are to correlate specific donations from individuals to the committees that are donating to candidates. This will help determine if the candidate is receiving funds in excess of campaign contribution limits. This will in turn better resolve the questions of whether politicians are skirting traditional fundraising law through independent expenditures. Of note to future research, we'll be tracking 24K independent expenditures for future election cycles to better understand if the 2020 election cycle use of 24K transactions was an anomaly or if it has been a standard practice for political fundraising. If the 2020 election cycle use of 24K transactions was an anomaly, what was the incentive behind the significant increase in the number of contributions? What was the purpose and what was the outcome of these contributions? Was there a law that was affected or implemented as a result of these contributions? Who were the primary recipients of these 24K transactions? This presentation, as well as the avenues for future research provided here, are an attempt to better understand the effect that 24K independent transactions as contributions are having on the political landscape and the ability for politicians to raise poorly regulated funds.